And thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to chat a little bit today about clinical trials in general, not just cancer trials, as you mentioned. We're actually going to talk about clinical trial enrollment as an evidence-based intervention. So I'm going to wrap all this around implementation science and sort of talk about an implementation science framing and approach. Part of my goal in general is to try to improve the capacity or build the capacity for implementation science in urology in general, not just for oncology and not just for clinical trials, but I think it's helpful to get as many people familiar with implementation science methods as possible. So please ask questions throughout. And I normally have trouble seeing the chat from the speaker view. So if somebody wants to just shout it out, if something comes up in the middle, it's worth interrupting is great.
Yep.
And I'm going to go through, and the sort of the way I'm going to frame this is the first little bit is some of the stuff that I've talked about and published on before that sort of sets the stage for the work that I'm working on now. And so we'll hit a certain point in this recording where I'd request that we turn either the recording off or edit afterwards, just because I have some ongoing work I'm going to present that's not quite ready for prime time. And so I have those slides clearly marked, but everything else will be shared afterwards, and happy to chat with people offline as well if any of this is of interest. So. With that as an intro, moving on to disclosures, I have no nefarious conflicts of interest financially, but I do have funding both from this K12 and part of my startup packages through our institutional NCI grant as well. And so today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk first an introduction into sort of clinical trial science and implementation science. I'm going to pitch clinical trials and clinical trial enrollment as what we call a complex evidence-based practice, which we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And we're going to talk about some of the struggles with clinical trials themselves, why this is important, and why I think it's important for everyone, urologists, oncologists, and just clinicians in general, to care about clinical trials themselves. I'm going to talk briefly about implementation science and trials, and then move on into sort of the brunt of what I'm doing at the K12 time, which is working on context assessment, and specifically rapid context assessment for clinical trial sites, and then move on to some next steps in clinical trials implementation science as we go. And as I mentioned, please interrupt at any time if you have questions as we go. So I'm going to talk a lot about context assessment today, and I think it's important to frame all this within my own context. I'm an aspiring health services and implementation scientist. Clinically, I am a urologic oncologist, but I practice at our VA here at the University of Michigan. So I do see all types of patients. I just primarily do our urologic oncology. And my career goals, which I'm heading towards with a K12 and onward, is to become a leader in clinical trial science. But as I mentioned, I also want to build capacity for implementation science in urology. I think this is kind of the natural next step. We've done a great job with encouraging health services research and identifying knowledge gaps and clinical healthcare delivery gaps. But sort of the next step is in intervention design, assessing real determinants of how and why we're delivering care in certain ways, and then overcoming those barriers. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Specific to the K12, my goals are to develop the skills and methods in rapid context assessment. So I have a decent basis in implementation science already, but developing that into a rapid way so that we sort of condense the timeline of our qualitative work primarily into a much more feasible time scale, specifically for clinical trials, but also for other things where you want to get new interventions really assessed and deployed as rapidly as possible, something that I really want to become an expert in. And then I want to identify barriers to trial enrollment in order to inform either an independent K08 or potentially an R01 that's building off of these barriers and rapid context assessment that I'm identifying now, so that I can develop skills in user-centered design and specifically intervention design for implementation interventions to overcome some of those barriers, both in clinical trials and in other areas in urology. And my longer-term goals are to develop and evaluate targeted clinical trial improvement strategies. So we'll be talking a lot about clinical trials and their problems today, and I want to eventually be designing ways to design and conduct better clinical trials. And the necessary skills and methods for this are implementation science theory, rapid context assessment, user-centered intervention design, and clinical trial and hybrid trial design and logistics. And anytime I give a talk about clinical trials, I always try to highlight clinical trial lists. Clinical trials are a huge amount of work, and I want to show appreciation and respect to all people who are involved in trials. So we're going to talk about clinical trial failure, and we're going to talk about why clinical trials fail. And I use this word fail a lot. And I just want to show respect for clinical trialists who are putting a ton of work in, and also patients and participants in trials who are investing time and other resources into trials. And the aim of talking about trial failure is really to focus on future improvement, same way that we might talk about failing patients with specific treatments. And the idea is not that we're not trying, it's that we need to focus on how to get better at them. So with that background out of the way, we're going to start talking about clinical trials, specifically as evidence-based practice, which is the first component of this idea of implementation science as applied to clinical trials. And so the question, if you are watching this presentation, is why should you care about clinical trials, particularly if you are not an oncologist, because that's where a lot of the clinical trials get emphasized. But clinical trials in all fields advance science, they lead to new treatments, and they benefit patients. And this is both once the trials are completed, through having new results and proving what works best, but also for individual participants on a clinical trial. And that's regardless of which arm you're assigned to. If we think about a clinical trial itself as essentially an implementation and intervention, you are forcing people to get the treatment as it's intended. So even if you're on the standard of care arm, you're not really getting standard of care like you are outside of a trial. You're getting the optimal form of that. So you're getting doses when you should get them, you're getting follow-up when you should, and oftentimes you're getting a little bit extra. So new imaging, other follow-up, you might be getting a care navigator, all those types of things. So there are benefits to enrolling on a trial, regardless of which arm you get, and those do go to individual participants. And in these ways, trial participation in some settings can be considered standard of care. So I'm going to go back to my oncology background, but in all of our NCCN guidelines, there's the statement that the best management for any patient with cancer is in a clinical trial, and participation in clinical trials is encouraged specifically by the NCCN. And I think that's going to apply to other settings as well, not just within cancer, but I do think that there is an improved care for patients. But even if not for that, there's still a benefit to society from enrolling on clinical trials. The next question is why care about trial conduct, which it seems I don't have to impress upon this group, which is great. So trials, on top of all of these benefits we just talked about, trials are also this huge source of both costs and, on the flip side, revenue. So sometimes I have to encourage people to care about clinical trials. And one way to do that is by playing up this idea of both costs and revenue. So there's at least $50 billion a year. Some people estimate closer to $200 billion a year that are invested in trials worldwide. And millions of dollars from individual centers are invested in trial support alone. So that's on top of the cost of running individual trials. You also have to pay clinical trial portfolio managers. You have to do the overhead for various things. And so centers are pouring a ton of money into this. And on top of that, you can increase revenue to your center for patients enrolled onto a trial. And this is just ways to encourage people to care about clinical trials. This is not the right reason to conduct a trial necessarily, but there are other considerations that we can't ignore. So we've already established that there are all these great benefits to clinical trials. There's lots invested into them. They're very important, but there are also some tribulations that come along with trials. We find that clinical trials actually very frequently fail. So most of my work in this area has been looking at cancer trials, but this does extend to other types of trials. There have been a few papers specific to urology that have been published on this topic as well. But we found that about 1 in 5 cancer clinical trials fails. And when I say fail, I mean that they end for a non-informative reason. So if a trial ends because of toxicity or efficacy, then that's informative, and that's a good reason for that trial to fail, because then we can infer something from the results of it. But if it fails, for example, because it doesn't enroll enough patients, or just logistically it was hard to launch, then there's nothing that we glean from that. And so that all the resources and all the investments in that trial are for naught, essentially. We did find that most trials fail because of low enrollment for at least some component, and we found thousands to tens of thousands of patients are enrolled onto trials that fail. And this makes this doubly important because when we're consenting patients to enroll onto a trial, there's this compact we make with them that they're investing themselves into science in order to help people that come after them. And if we don't do everything we can to make those trials complete at a better rate, then we're starting to violate that compact with people, where that promise that this might help people come after you maybe goes away if we're wasting their investment in those trials. And ultimately, trial enrollment is low and slow, and it's been this way for a really long time. At least in the world of cancer, about 2 to 8% of eligible patients will enroll on trials. This seems pretty similar to the benign urology space, but we haven't looked at it explicitly. And it suggests that a majority of patients may not be receiving the best possible care. Additionally, few trials across the board complete enrollment in a planned timeframe. This is both in cancer and non-cancer trials. And there's a ballooning expenditure that goes into trials, both from the sort of protocol approval phase, the conduct phase, the enrollment phase, and the cost of all of this is extremely expensive and rising. And there's a secondary piece of this is that also it's not only that trials are taking longer, but also when trials complete, they don't always reach their anticipated accrual goal. And so we took a look at this within cancer trials, again, in urologic oncology, and found that about half of all trials failed to meet 85% of their goal enrollment. And a third of trials that were marked as completed failed to meet that same marker of sufficiency. So this means that some trials that are getting through to the end point may be underpowered, or on the flip side, if they were able to answer the questions with fewer patients than they thought, maybe some of our other trials are actually overpowered and we can be more efficient in pushing out our interventions to folks who need them earlier. So summing up so far, trials have huge benefits, can be considered evidence-based practice, but trial enrollment has remained low. This perhaps reflects poor implementation. So again, getting to that point of this idea of sort of clinical trial protocol, is it a design problem from the clinical trials? Maybe, but I think that's a bigger hurdle to come over. And so what we're going to focus on is reflecting poor implementation of the clinical trial protocol, which again has this whole other aspect of things, including figuring out who should lead your trials, where you pick your sites, all that, which we're going to talk about going forward. And so how we have posited all of this is that clinical trials are complex evidence-based practices that are often suffering from poor implementation. And it has a very intentional word selection in here to fit into the larger frame of implementation science, which is what we'll talk about now. And we're going to frame all of this within implementation science. I hope some of you are familiar with, but we're going to do a brief walkthrough of how we're applying that to clinical trials. And for those who are not familiar with implementation science, the basic approach for this is how do we get people to do good things more and better, or to do bad things less? If clinical trials are so good, the question is, why aren't more people enrolling? And if you frame this in the same way that we have other things that are really good, why aren't people doing them more? It's not that the thing itself is bad. So it's not that our clinical trial protocol is bad. It could be that the implementation of it is poor. Similar to, we have lots of interventions that are good, and the reason that people aren't doing it is something completely outside of the efficacy of it. And then our question is how do we close that evidence to practice gap? So backing up just for a minute, one of the ways that I like to frame implementation science still, just to think about this clinical trials, even though I don't have to get a ton of buy-in from this group, which is great. But there's this idea of something being extremely beneficial, but not having real world effectiveness because it's not implemented well. And so my best example of this from recent years is that vaccines, specifically vaccines for like COVID, were great and efficacious in clinical trials. But in the real world, because not as many people use them as we would have liked, we didn't have effectiveness in the real world from the vaccines like there was in clinical trials. And so this is reflecting poor implementation of an evidence-based intervention. And so within the context of vaccines, evidence-based practice or evidence-based intervention is the vaccine. And then we're trying to get uptake. We're trying to get people to accept it. We're trying to deliver it to different areas, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. Trying to get it out to different sites around the world was hard. And so you have this inequitable uptake. So effectiveness can be different around different groups. But within our context for clinical trials, the evidence-based practice is the clinical trial, and specifically the clinical trial protocol, and pushing that out to as many people as possible. And so the ultimate goal here is increasing and improving the real world use of things. I'm going to skip over a little bit because this seems to be great for everyone. So our trials problem that we're going to focus on today and lead into what I'm working on now is this trial enrollment problem. And so my big question is, how do we improve trial enrollment? As I said, that eye-popping 2 to 8% number, why has that not improved over the course of the last 25 years? There have been a few strategies to try to improve recruitment to randomized trials, but very few of them have been reproducible, and only 3 out of 72 studies in this Cochrane review had high grade evidence. And some of the problems with some of the studies that have been done so far is that it's things like drastically changing the design of a trial. So they found that like doing an open label study instead of a blinded placebo trial made it so that patients are more likely to enroll. But that starts to mess with the scientific integrity and results of the trial. So my question is how do we not alter the design of a trial and instead try to improve enrollment to it? The other question here is if we try something and it works, will it work everywhere? So a lot of these studies were done within a single center, or they're evaluating one specific context. But if I do something in cancer, is that going to apply to the UTI trial we were just talking about? And one of the advantages of applying implementation sciences is we can put in these other contextual assessment factors so that I can tell how and why what I'm doing works within cancer or within benign urology stuff like a UTI trial or like a stent trial I've been working on, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to try to apply that across the board. In order to do this, we really need a structured approach to improving enrollment as opposed to just kind of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing if it's going to work. And so I wrote a paper and developed a conceptual model to structure this approach within an implementation science context where we take a problem, we try to identify the root cause, figure out how to measure it, and then we can identify barriers to improvement based on those measures and then develop strategies to overcome the barriers. We're not going to do a super deep dive into all of the implementation frameworks here, but there is sort of a linking framework for each of these. The cause of the outcome, implementation outcome that we've used Proctor's outcomes for, C for domain, which is called a determinant framework, and then linking that back to ERIC-based implementation strategies. This can get sort of out there, so I want to show just a walkthrough example of one way that we can apply this. So if we have our trial side outcome, we've been talking about poor enrollment being a big problem. And this could be due to multiple causes. One of these could be that there's low local disease prevalence. And so maybe the reason my prostate cancer trials are not enrolling is because I just don't have a lot of prostate cancer cases around. Alternatively, it could be that our providers are too busy for trials. And so even though we have plenty of patients around, maybe I'm too busy in my clinic seeing 40 patients a day to spend the time explaining the trial to patients. We can then link this back to the implementation frameworks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is a problem of trial feasibility. If there's low local disease prevalence, this is something in the outer setting. So it's something that I can't control myself. And one potential strategy that could do to improve enrollment is to add more trial sites in other areas where there are more cases of prostate cancer. So the ultimate way this does is sort of do a root cause analysis almost of finding the actual reason, so low local disease prevalence, and then linking it to a very targeted and tailored strategy of adding more trial sites. If instead my problem is that the providers I have are too busy for trials, then something that might work would be to hire more research staff instead, because I have plenty of people around, plenty of potential participants, but I need to reach them better. So this is getting back to our question and discussion before of where we're losing people. And the advantage of lining this out or laying this out like this is being able to figure out where are we leaking patients essentially, and how can we overcome that. The problem with some of the approaches that people have done before is they might start out and say, well, what I want to do is hire more research staff because I have poor enrollment. But if you hire more research staff and the actual problem is that you don't have a lot of patients around, then that's not going to address the problem. So for example, if I have 10 prostate cancer patients who come every year to my practice, if my goal is to enroll 100 patients, I can never hire enough research staff to hire more prostate cancer patients than I see. It's just not going to work. And so if I ran a study of that, I would say hiring more research staff doesn't help when it was actually never possible to enroll more patients. And so we've talked about implementation science. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this and go right to the context assessment. And so we're trying to decide what works where so that we can target our interventions a little bit better. And this is going to get in a minute into exactly what I'm doing in like K12 now. And so we talk a lot about context assessment and implementation science, and there are really multiple levels of context which are going to influence how well stuff can be implemented. So there are levels of the patient, the provider, or your group, the organization, and all the way up to the levels of market and policy that are all going to influence how well your interventions can be done. And for clinical trials, this kind of goes double. So again, as we were talking about with that 2 to 8% level of participation, there are all types of contextual assessments which can factor into why patients may or may not be enrolling. And some of these are super obvious, like not having access physically to a clinical trial site, but some of them are also very subtle, where there might be things like cultural differences among either urologists or among patients in certain areas that may make it much harder to enroll folks. And so the question here is how we can structure context assessment so that we can get as much information back as we possibly can and directly inform the interventions we're going to develop to try to overcome these barriers to enrollment. And so we're looking for barriers and facilitators, which is sort of the implementation science parlance of what makes stuff work. So either what makes it work or what stops it from working. These are also known as determinants. And our question here is what is helping or hurting our trial enrollment? And use a determinant framework for this, and we've elected to use the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFIR, which you'll see a lot. It's, I think, the most commonly used determinant framework. Some other examples of this would be the Theoretical Domains Framework or the Tailored Implementation and Chronic Disease Framework. The reason we use the CFIR is that it's a great framework for identifying determinants, has 5 domains containing 37 constructs. This is just a great way to kind of have a checklist of assessing all the components or many of the components of the context surrounding clinical trials. It's already used extensively in implementation research, so there's a pretty good crosstalk already between the other frameworks that we have, like the outcomes frameworks, and directly targeting and feeding into interventions we might be developing. And so what we did was adapt the CFIR specifically for trials. The 5 domains that we're going to talk about are intervention characteristics, outer and inner setting, characteristics of individuals, and process models. And each of these have links to specific characteristics of clinical trials that we're going to be analyzing in order to try to find what either helps or hinders enrollment to trials. And so some of the things that might be barriers are, for example, what is being tested in the trial. So we talked about things that are part of the protocol earlier that might make it more or less likely that patients are going to enroll. And so if there are a few other treatments, for example, then you might have a high relative advantage of that trial. So in prostate cancer, if you've already run through all of the standard of care options and you're sort of on your like 4th line treatment, you might have a high relative advantage of enrolling onto a trial because you might be very likely or that may be the only way you'd be likely to get something that might work. So if we're talking about, for the UTI example, if you had a highly drug-resistant pathogen that kept giving you a recurrent urinary tract infection, it might be that the only way you could find something to treat that would be through a clinical trial. Whether if you came in with a pan-sensitive E. coli right away, there are lots of other things you could use to treat that are already proven. And so you wouldn't necessarily have the same incentive to enroll in a trial. The other thing for this is that there might be lots of existing data, and so you could have a high evidence strength. So if, for example, there's something that has worked really well for a lung infection, and now we're doing a trial for a urinary tract infection, there's a good chance that things are going to work in the bladder if it already worked in the lung. And so you might be more likely to enroll on that trial as opposed to one where there's no existing evidence for that, for example, new antibiotic. Another thing that influences this is, can you stop it, or trialability? So if you're doing a surgical trial, it's going to be a big barrier to entry as opposed to something like a prevention trial, where if you take a daily medication, if you don't like the side effects, you can stop it and presumably they'll go away, but it's very hard to reverse a surgery once you get it. And so some things to consider here would be, as I mentioned, a drug trial for previously untreatable cancer, phase 3 drug trial for a drug that's effective in other settings might be more likely, and trial for surgical removal of an organ. Moving on from that, sort of zooming way out, there are components of the outer setting which are going to influence why patients may enroll in a trial or not. Big question here is does a trial accurately reflect local needs? And so this is to say, again, if there is lots of prostate cancer that's going untreated in one area of the country, there may be a high demand for a trial there. But if there's not, or people are generally happy with their treatment in that area of the country, then it may not reflect what people want or need, might not reflect their priorities, and so people are going to be less likely to enroll. Some other questions here might be how connected a trial site is to other organizations. And so this could be, for example, if I'm running a trial at the University of Michigan, how likely are people at Ohio State going to be to enroll patients to that trial as opposed to a trial that they're running? Other things can be things like peer pressure. So if all of my partners are enrolling lots of patients onto trials, then I may also feel the pressure to do that. But if you're in a setting where not a lot of people are enrolling patients on trials, you may be less enthused to do that. Similarly, this could be within subspecialties in urology. So in oncology, we think about clinical trials all the time, and that's sort of a standard piece of our practice is thinking about trials, discussing trials. That's at our meetings all the time. But that may not be the case for some other subspecialties, and you may not feel the same pressure to enroll folks. 0 in the chat. There's also external policy and incentives that exist for trials. As I mentioned, you can get money for enrolling your patients onto trials, but there are other things like government incentives for participating, grant funding, and even within your own organization, you may have career advancement or other incentives to participate in trials. And this importance of context is something that is super important, specifically for trials, but also across implementation science. And where a trial is set is going to hugely impact how it's implemented. Health policy can be way different in different countries, obviously, but this can also apply to states. There can be differences in the way people are reimbursed for care and reimbursed in a trial or outside of a trial. That may influence how likely a provider is to offer them. There can be incentives to trials, even though some of this has some ethical issues to it. You may get a kickback for enrolling patients on, or you might be disincentivized by saying if you enroll a patient onto a trial, it may mean that you can't bill for the care you would provide them otherwise. And even though we should be doing what's best for patients all the time, we can't deny or ignore the fact that there are these sort of disincentives for participating. And there are also lots of geographic considerations. So here's our beautiful maize and blue college champion state highlighted here. And it can be very difficult for patients in different areas to access clinical trials. So we have this whole Upper Peninsula in Michigan that can take 12 hours, 14 hours to drive from there down to Ann Arbor. And so if I'm trying to enroll patients and they live in the UP, it's going to be very difficult for them to come down to me frequently to enroll in a trial. So we have to come up with something else to try to get those patients enrolled in a trial. And that's just a huge, somewhat obvious, but I think underappreciated barrier to enrollment. I'm going to gloss a little bit over some of these others, but there are other domains such as components of your institution itself, incentives within your organization, and then of course characteristics of individuals, which is both providers and patients' beliefs about sort of the trial intervention clinical trials themselves. And then the process domain is going to talk a little bit more about planning for trial implementation, folks who are sort of boots on the grounds trying to enroll people, and then how much things like evaluation are in place for the actual conduct of the trial itself. So there are multiple levels of barriers and facilitators to success, and for trials, this can range from the intervention itself, which is really part of the protocol, all the way up to international drug policy and reimbursements. And I think that using a determinate framework for trials can really organize these factors and highlight areas that we're going to be able to hopefully design interventions to overcome these enrollment barriers. And so in my last minute here, as I mentioned, this so far, we've been focusing on enrollment sort of as a whole, just like numbers to trials in general. But we can refocus this approach on other gaps. It doesn't have to be just poor enrollment. It can be things like equitable enrollment. And so, for example, in the VA, we've had a lot of problems getting Black men to enroll on our prostate cancer trials. We have hit all of our enrollment goals for sort of white American veterans, and we're really struggling to identify Black American men who are willing to enroll. And I think that this same approach can be applied to exactly that problem of saying, let's use these frameworks, let's figure out, meet with patients, figure out why this is such a problem, meet with providers, figure out where the gaps are there, and try to engage with that. As I mentioned, representation in clinical trials has been poor historically, and I think we can do a much better job of figuring out where the gaps are so we can overcome them. And I think the implementation lens could provide the needed context for ensuring these interventions engage, include, and are appropriate for all of our patients and our providers. So in summary, clinical trials are evidence-based interventions currently suffering from poor implementation. I think that applying implementation science to trials can build a platform for trial improvement through rigorous science and shared vocabulary. And we can use implementation science for both this and other areas in urology to better fill these gaps in getting our evidence-based practices out there. So lots of acknowledgements. Thanks to all my mentoring team. One more shot of the big house, and of course to the CAIRIBU K12